He's not Keir Starmer, but luckily the man in front of me is Keir Starmer. And do you see your job, Sir Keir, as Brexit Secretary, Shadow Brexit Secretaries, clearing up in the next few minutes all that confusion?
I'm very happy to do so. And, we've got a big conference going on here, thousands of people here. And, of course, there are going to be different views. But what happened on Sunday night was that we got 300 or so delegates into a room to composite a motion to reach agreement. We had to reach consensus.
For people who don't know, is a way of forging a form of words.
It's when you get a sort of motion that we can then put for a vote, and we're going to do it today. And we reached consensus. Now, that is amazing. And today
it is particularly amazing that the Shadow Chancellor, who was sitting in that chair yesterday, didn't know what the consensus was. He backed the view of the leading trade unionist here, Len McCluskey. Tom Watson, who's then the deputy leader of the party, said something different. Barry Gardner, who was the Shadow International Trade Secretary, said a third thing.
Well, shall I try and set out exactly what the motion says that we're going to be voting on?
Please do.
And where there is consensus. And we're going to vote on it this afternoon. I predict that there will be full support for it. What it recognises is that the negotiations are in a complete mess, and we're heading for either a very bad deal or no deal. So we say logically, therefore, the first decision we have to make as a party is, are we going to vote for what the Prime Minister brings back? I set 6 tests for that at the beginning of the process. Those tests weren't plucked out of thin air. They were actually based on the commitments that the government made. And when I set out the test, the Prime Minister was asked for a reaction. And she said, I'm determined to meet those tests. So we will apply those tests, and if it doesn't meet the test, we'll vote it down. In ordinary circumstances, if that happened, a general election ought to follow, because if the Prime Minister has either not reached an agreement or brought back an agreement, doesn't have the confidence of Parliament, then she ought to go. If that doesn't happen, then we're looking at what then happens.
And there might be a referendum. Let's come to the detail.
No, let me just, because we're saying
in a second,
if there's no general election, what then are the options to prevent us crashing out without a deal? And one of those is a public vote. So there's a logical sequencing to this, and everybody accepts that that's logical, and the whole party...
They may accept it's logical, they just seem very confused as to what the logic is and what the sequence is and what the structure is. Let's take it one at a time.
The sequence is obvious.
Well, it wasn't obvious to John McDonnell, sorry, and he is the Shadow Chancellor. He got it wrong yesterday. Or did he reveal yesterday what most people think he and Jeremy Corbyn and their main ally, Len McCluskey, really think, which is we don't want to risk our electoral coalition by promising a referendum, so we'll come up with this fairly meaningless promise that says it's still on the table.
No, the motion, I was in the room for nearly 6 hours on Sunday with the delegates. The clear position is that if there's no general election, then an option must be a public vote. The room, the delegates said, well, we don't want to narrow the question down. We don't want to rule out things like Remain. But we do not know the situation we'll find ourselves in.
Yeah, just to be clear, John McDonnell, sorry to keep doing this to you, did rule out Remain on this programme yesterday, and then he changed his mind.
We finished our meeting about 1 a.m, and then John was up early doing the media round. I think John...
So he was struggling with not enough sleep?
No, to be fair, John did a number of interviews yesterday, and I think you know that he did say later in the day that all options are on the table. So just trying to sort of find this divide between a party which is actually coming together today around a proposition, it is fine, and I understand it. But actually,
I think people who listened to the interview yesterday will understand that he was given, I think, 4 different opportunities to be clear.
Well,
and the clarity he came up with is that the vote would be on the deal, in other words, between the deal or no deal, and that Remain was excluded. We're perfectly happy to take your word that, he wasn't in line with party policy and he's now changed his mind.
Well, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we've got a proposition. It's going to be put to a vote today. There's going to be unity behind that. And I'll tell you what, I'll compare 1 o'clock today when we vote on that around this proposition to what is going to happen next week at the Tory party conference. If by Tuesday there's a proposition voted on at the Tory party conference around which they have all agreed, I'll be astonished. But that's going to happen today with the Labour Party. So you can pick the differences, and that's all good fun.
But let's move on from there. Move on from that. I think it's more than fun. It's rather important to people whether Labour is clear about its policy. But let's move on to what your central message today is, how you will approach a deal, if there's a deal, brought back by the Prime Minister. Now, you say the phrasing we've been given is no ifs, no buts. No ifs, no buts. You will vote against this deal because it fails to meet your tests. Let's be clear what that would mean. This would mean the Labour Party, your Labour Party, going into the voting lobbies with Jacob Rees-Mogg, with Boris Johnson, with hardline Brexiteers to vote down a deal signed by President Macron of France, Angela Merkel of Germany, and your own Prime Minister. You are prepared to do that, are you?
Well, Nick, I see it the other way round. This deal will go through unless the Conservative Party splits. In an ordinary world, a Prime Minister would have her own team behind her. So the whole question here only arises if some of the Tories are in voting with us against their government. So it's actually the opposite of the position that you described. So
but you have a choice as an opposition. You can back a deal done by the government, and just to repeat, along with, if she gets a deal, 27 other elected leaders in Europe, or you, the opposition, can say, we're going to tear it up.
I think it's going to be a very bad deal. I don't think it's going to meet our tests. And we shouldn't be voting for a deal which we don't think is in the national interest.
But the consequence then would be what you've described as the very worst possible outcome. No deal.
We cannot carry on with this idea that the Prime Minister can bring back any deal that she cobbles together and we must all vote for it, however awful it is, because something even worse will happen if we don't. What is the point? That's not a meaningful vote. To say to parliamentarians, well, you can have a vote on this deal, but by the way, if you don't vote for it, you're going to get something much worse. And there has to be a point where Parliament says it is not good enough. And I don't think there's a majority in Parliament for no deal. I don't think no deal is the consequence. That's why we're putting other options on the table.
I hear that you don't think it's the consequence and you don't want it, but the truth is, and this is not your fault, it's the nature of opposition politics, you can't deliver a general election. It's doubtful you can deliver a referendum either. What you can deliver is a failure to get any agreement, which in plain language means no deal. But that's what the opposition may deliver.
Nick, what you're putting to me is this. Because the Conservatives are so divided that they can't get that deal through because they're going to split, the Labour Party's got to step into the breach and support the Prime Minister on a bad deal, because otherwise we'll get no deal, which we
putting
do not
to you
accept.
That you have a choice whether to back President Macron, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, or Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. It is your choice.
All of the EU leaders and the EU have said, if the red lines were changed, we could have had a different discussion, a different agreement. So we're only in this place because of the failure of the negotiating strategy from start to finish. And Nick, what you would expect with now 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks, to the next summit is for the gap between the EU and the UK to be being closed. This Prime Minister, in other words, this is not unusual in negotiations that there's a gap and then one party moves into that gap, the other moves and there's an agreement. That can't happen here because our Prime Minister is in a straitjacket. She can't step forward because of the divisions in her own party.
Well, I want to ask you what you would do if you were in office, because you're clear and you're being very open about this. You can't guarantee a general election. You can hope for one. But you might be the person negotiating the deal if there is indeed a general election. So let's talk about what Labour would do. The EU says, effectively, it's either Norway, effectively Norway plus a kind of membership of the single market and the customs union, very close to the EU, or it's kind of a version of Canada, a free trade deal in which you're clearly out of all these things and borders arise. You have said neither. So you are cherry-picking in just the way that the government say that are accused of cherry-picking by Brussels. You say you don't want free movement, an offer that is not currently available from the EU. So you're not guilty of exactly the same impossible negotiating stance as the government.
Nick, this idea that the UK simply has to sort of pick a model that some other country has negotiated is just wrong in principle. And I don't think the EU is really saying that. What Norway did was to negotiate an agreement which in the early 90s worked for Norway just after the Berlin Wall came down. What Canada did was to negotiate something in the 21st century that works for Canada. Each agreement is in the end tailored to the country in question. But you're right, there is a difference. The difference is not can you find a model and sort of try it on and see if it works, because it won't. The question is, do you want to be economically close or economically distant?
And you want to be close.
We want to be economically close. Yep. But it will have to be an agreement which is tailored to the UK with the right balance of rights and obligations.
But let me give you an example of why I pose the questions the way I do. As you know, the allies of the party leadership boast of having a policy of constructive ambiguity, which is a posh way of facing two ways at the same time. Now, let me give you an example of it. Labour's policy is, correct, to have no free movement. That's what you are committed to in your manifesto. That the motion that you say all the party backs today criticises Theresa May's Brexit deal for, quotes, threatening freedom of movement. Well, which is it? Are you in favour of freedom of movement or are you opposed to freedom?
What we've said is that as we leave the EU, freedom of movement falls away because it's an EU rule.
But why have you got a motion, therefore, criticising Theresa May for threatening it? You should be praising her, shouldn't you?
Just let me finish, if you will. What we then have to say is what then is on the blank piece of paper that is an immigration policy. And we would have a principle-based approach. And of course, and I've said this a number of times, we recognise that in a sensible world where you are supporting your industries and your economy and you are letting families reunite and communities live together, you would have movement of people across borders to work, you'd have families reuniting, you'd want students to come to this country. So the idea that you suddenly default to no movement, there's no room to discuss anything with the EU is wrong in principle. But I'll tell you this, if we had started these negotiations by very clearly saying to the EU, we want a close economic relationship, we want a customs union, and we want a single market deal tailored to the UK that works with the obligations and the benefits, we would be in a very different place. Doesn't mean it's easy, doesn't mean we wouldn't be having difficult discussions about immigration, but we would be well down a completely different track.
You've raised immigration, and it is crucial. As you'll know, the Cabinet have been discussing a new immigration policy. Do you, Labour, believe they are right to take the view that citizens who want to come to this country should be treated the same, regardless of whether they're coming from the EU or the rest of the world?
As for how people are treated when they come here, I think there is deep resentment of the hostile environment that's applied to some people who come here and not to others. And that's deeply felt and has been exposed over the last few months. And anything that ensures there isn't that sort of discrimination wherever people come from is a good thing. That having been said, if you want a close economic relationship with the EU, then obviously that will involve a discussion about EU citizens. I wait to see what the detail is the government comes out with. But the principle that you treat people fairly when they get here and don't discriminate in this way is right.
Rather briefly, if you would, a question really as a Democrat rather than as a spokesman for the opposition. Isn't there a danger on both sides that you signal to people in the future, people from the EU be treated exactly the same as everybody else. And as soon as there's any sort of deal, a trade deal, the reality will dawn on the public, which is whether you're in power or the Tories are in power, some sort of special migration arrangements will be made for people from the EU.
Nick, a very fair question. That's why I would be cautious at this stage of saying what the arrangement will be, because if you want a close economic relationship with the EU, it is right that you may have to have as part of that an agreement on EU nationals. So you're absolutely right, and that's why, in a sense, until the government puts detail on it, we don't know. But actually, this is part of the negotiations, needs to be part of the negotiations.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much indeed.